Hey guys, and welcome back to the Trevor May Baseball channel. I know I've had a little bit of a hiatus here in the offseason, especially during the lockout. Not a lot of baseball content going out, and I kind of made that pledge myself during that time. But to give you a little update on the lockout, we're still in it, and I do not know when it's going to end. I will not get too far into that. I wanted to start a new series. Really quick intro here. I get a lot of questions about the differences between pitches. A lot of people play MLB The Show that interact with a lot with me, and there are lots of different variations of different pitches in that game, and many people are struggling with the differences, and that's starting to happen more and more in the live game as well. Things being referred to with terminology that you may not have heard before. So I thought that I would dive in pitch by pitch and do a little series called Pitching 101, where I break down each pitch, and then what signifies the name that they're given, what factors go in to that. And without further ado, we're gonna get into fastballs. Before we get into the different kinds of fastballs, there's a couple pieces of information you need to know, prerequisites you need to know about how pitches are named and defined. Sometimes it has to do with the grip, sometimes it has to do with the movement of the pitch, sometimes it's some combination of both. So there's no set way. Basically, it's just a way to distinguish one pitch that is slightly different from another variation of that same pitch based on one of those two factors. Okay, so those will factor in every single time we go over one. Now, first and foremost, we have my favorite pitch, the four-seam fastball. Across the seams here, I have the horseshoe on the inside. This is how I throw my four-seam fastball. You can throw it with the inside. You can cock it off to the right or the left. You can do variations. Pitchers are tinkerers by profession, by nature, but those all signify a four-seam fastball. It gets its name from having 4 points of contact between your fingers and the seams. 4 points of contact, four-seam fastball. Now, four-seam fastballs are supposed to be a little bit straighter, and as of the last few years, high spin rates and high carry fastballs, meaning defying gravity for longer periods of time to get guys to swing underneath it, have become the norm. Fastballs up are almost always four seams by nature. No one is throwing a sinker up on purpose. They're throwing four seams. So to give you a little bit of an example, this is a four-seam I threw in September of last year. You will see the movement profile and where the location is. Up in the zone, you want it to carry. Of course, I strut around because I am one of those people, and that is a well-executed four-seam fastball. Other examples of guys who rely highly on four-seam fastballs, Liam Hendricks, Josh Hader, myself, Sugar Diaz, and many other people that throw high fastballs. Some guys I played with in the past. Tyler Duffy throws high fastballs, and it's become a very highly used pitch when you're throwing your four seam. Next up, we have the sinker. It can be held in a two-seam grip. Most often it is some sort of variation pulled off the seams like that or like that. It is some sort of grip that allows you to get the ball to travel downwards, and with some arm side run, whatever arm you throw with, if it's moving in the direction that you're of the side of the body your arm is on, that is called arm side. The glove side is the opposite. So you want arm side run, but mostly downward. Again, north and south has become the norm in baseball the last few years because of the ability to miss bats. Side to side is a little bit easier to make contact with. So when you're throwing a sinker, you would like it to sink. You would like it to go with gravity as the opposite of a four seam. The four seam wants to defy gravity. You want sinkers to go with gravity. They get more contact in general, or ground balls, but sinker grips can vary wildly. So this is an example of the pitch description being based mostly on how it moves and not necessarily how it is gripped. Here is another example of a great sinker. And of course, we're talking about Blake Trinan once again, as he does have one of the best sinkers in the game at the moment. As you will notice, goes down. It's a great depth on it. Ground ball to third. First out of the inning. Exactly what you want out of a sinker. He does throw a cutter and a four seam as well. But his sinker is definitely probably the one with the highest movement metrics, the best movement metrics in terms of his fastball. Another great example of a sinker, we fondly called him Fama, but Juris Familia. One of the better sinker downward movement profiles of a sinker in the game still to this moment. This thing looks like a splitter in how hard it dives. And that's swung at if you saw the swing out of Real Muto right there, it looked like he was swinging at a slider. That's when you know you have a hard downward moving sinker and you are throwing a pitch that is being executed like it is supposed to be executed. Next up, we have the two seam, often confused with the sinker. Sinkers and two seams in the professional game are different pitches. Two seam fastball, as you can see, is along the seams like this. This is the most traditional two seam. Everyone can move their thumb or their finger. It's all about finger pressure when you're throwing pitches. But what you're trying to get is more arm side movement than down. So as a sinker was lots of down with little arm, you want a lot of arm with a little down this way. So you are thinking more off the plate, back onto the plate. And here's a prime example of my teammate Taijuan Walker. He phased this thing in quite a bit, and this is a beautiful example of throwing a pitch that looks like a ball, ends up being a strike, and old Sanchez knows it. That's a great example of an executed two-seam fastball. Another example here. Now, something to be said about Marcus when he throws his two-seam fastballs. He throws a variation. He throws a sinker. He throws a two-seam. He throws a bunch of different variations of fastballs in order to get a specific effect. He is taking it a little bit with his body control, taking it to a little bit of a next level. And this is a great example of him throwing a two-seam for a strike as opposed to a sinker for a ground ball. He wants this pitch taken. And he gets what he wants. Now, worth pointing out with Stroman, he had, if you notice, him and Taijuan threw the same pitch, but because their arms angles are different, Taijuan's a little higher, Marcus is a little lower, and their difference in height, the angle from the camera there on those pitches looked a lot different, but their movement was very similar. So what they were trying to do is throw a pitch to their glove side, again, their off throwing shoulder, and they wanted to come back over the plate and be called a strike. That pitch was not meant to be swung at. If anything, if it's located correctly, it will be taken, especially in those counts. With two strikes, you're battling, you don't want to swing at something too far in and strike out. Usually guys throw breaking balls, you don't want to chase those down there. So it's a very high freeze pitch, and especially early in the count. First pitch, guys just going to take that because there's nothing they can do with it. So both those pitches, well executed. That is a two-seam, as we usually are talking about it in our game right now. Next up, we have the one-seam fastball. I feel like, at least for me in my general orbit of my teammates recently, the one-seam has fallen a little bit out of vogue. People are just calling it a sinker or just calling it something else, two-seam a lot of times when it's actually a one-seam. But the difference between a one-seam and a sinker is just the grip. So a lot of guys have thrown one-seams like this where they only have one point of contact, meaning they're only on one lace, or they have one finger on a lace, like or on the outside or the inside here, and then they bring the other one off, or they go off this seam. So what it's supposed to do is maximize the sinker effect. You're still going for a dive. You're still going for downward movement. You just happen to grip it differently than a lot of other people's sinker. So the one seam tag or the one seam descriptor is literally just to explain that I grip one seam in order to throw my sinker, but movement wise they're almost exactly the same, or at least really close. You're trying to get that same type of effect. The example that I'm using here is, I don't know of anyone in the last couple years who says they throw a one seam, but I know that Zach Britton did throw one for a while. So we're going to look at 2018 Zach Britton to give you an example of what that looks like. Now, as you can see from the video, it had a little bit of arm side run, but Zach's fastball has had a lot of depth, very similar to a left-handed Familia. When they're good, they were throwing almost like a right-handed slider or cutter would look at 97 miles an hour. Now, when you're throwing a one-seam at that hard, your movement is going to be incredible, and prime Zach Britton was incredible. But that is the general differences when people are talking about a one seam versus a sinker. It's just to give a little bit more context on the grip, not necessarily the movement. Next up is one that is very confusing. I get a lot of questions on the running fastball. Now, this is made popular in MLB The Show. They use it as an example. And usually it is just describing the movement of the pitch and doesn't really matter about the grip. A lot of people throw two-seam running fastballs, which it's a two-seam at that point. But most of the time, this is a four-seam fastball that isn't a carry fastball per se. Doesn't have a high spin rate, and it doesn't necessarily defy gravity that much. So guys who throw really low arm slots a lot of times have a running fastball, but most of the time it's a four-seam grip that doesn't move quite like a traditional four-seam with a higher arm slot would. So our example in this case is another teammate of mine, Sugar Diaz. Now notice when we're watching this, Shug's arm slot. He's a little bit lower, especially lower than me. His movement profile via analytics is kind of average carry and a little bit of average arm side run and pretty average spin rate. The thing that makes him really, really, really effective is his arm slot and the way that his body explodes towards the plate. So he has some deception, and he has a really good arm slot, and it seems to speed up as it goes. So his velocity at 99 miles an hour actually looks harder than that. So it's very hard to get the bat around or get yourself going when something that's already extremely hard and hard to react to seems faster. So that's what makes his running fastball so effective. But the problem with having a running fastball generally is that with kind of those average metrics is that if you get back down towards the average velocity, it's harder and harder and harder to get misses. And finally, I actually bounced back and forth between whether or not I wanted to include this one in the fastballs or the breaking balls, but we have the cut fastball, or the cutter, if you will. Because I decided to do it in the fastballs one, because the guys who I'm going to give you examples of who have mastered the cutter have thrown it, the majority of the pitches they've thrown in their career have been cutters, and because that kind of falls into the fastball category, I'm going to include it here. First up, we have Kenley Jansen. Kenley Jansen is the closer for the LA Dodgers, if you've been living under a rock, and he is one of the best cutters maybe in the history of baseball, and he's had many, many years of success for it. But what defines a cutter is both the grip, so usually it's a four-seam grip that has been offset closer to a slider grip, and then the thumb is usually moved away from the inside of the ball. So in order to get most of the pressure on the outside of the ball, then it spins like this, and if thrown hard enough and at the right angle and with the right amount of spin, you will get an explosive movement glove side, as opposed to the two-seam wanting to move arm side. So it's the opposite of a two-seam. Think about it that way. Here he goes. He's going to locate this down in the way. And that's a perfectly executed cutter. Taken because he throws so many cutters, people assumed that it would be off of the plate. This example, it was not. And then lastly, our last example of the cutter, Mariano Rivera. That man is the greatest cutter pitcher of all time. He's thrown 90% cutters for his whole career. This is his last year punching out Adrianza of all the people that I could find for him to throw to, and he was still doing it. Maximizing, using the cutter off the plate, coming back over to lefties, throwing cutters into lefties, and breaking bats. I remember when I was with the Twins, we gave him a rocking chair made out of broken bats because he broke so many bats as his retirement gift. No one's retired really since 2014 in this way, where they got in presents. But yeah, we did that a few years back. You know, the cutter was the number one pitch in the major leagues, at least amongst starters, for a long time. Roy Halladay made it very popular because he was so good at locating it, and Cliff Lee. They're both on the same team. I was with the Phillies organization, so I'm very, very well acquainted with them throwing a cutter. And so everyone in the Phillies wanted to throw a cutter as well in the minors. So cutter can be a very, very, very effective pitch, being a slight version of a breaking ball. However, sometimes if you throw a lot of cutters, you start to lose the carry on your four-seam fastball, and that's why I don't throw it. It's important for me to have very distinguished pitches from my four-seam because it is my most effective pitch most of the time. Now, there will become a time where movement is what I need to focus on mostly, but until that happens, sticking with Old Faithful is the way to have success at this level. So I hope this video was insightful. I hope you learned a lot about the differences between different fastballs and why they are called the thing that they are called. Let me know down in the comments what you thought. Let me know what other pitches you would like me to break down. Trust me, I have a plan for every single group of pitches, breaking balls, changeups, and then everything else in between, and giving you a good idea of those pitches and how they're gripped and the things that are involved with them. But if there's anything that I might miss, I will be trawling. I'll be reading the comments below to get your guys' input on those things and see what else you want to hear about. So thank you guys. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm going to try to be doing more little fun things like this, educational videos in the future. And I'll see you next time on the Trevor May Baseball channel. Have a good day. Bye.